Welcome to Joshua's story. This is presentation number 1 in the series, and I've entitled this, Preparing for Battle. Joshua's story, Preparing for Battle. What do we know about the man Joshua? We meet him first here where he was a young army leader, and he proved himself in leadership. Shortly after that, Moses took him as his personal assistant. And indeed he had decades with Moses learning from the great man. He was one of the 12 spies that were sent out into the southern part of Canaan, and he was a man who saw possibilities, not difficulties. Later he was commissioned by Moses to take over from Moses and to lead the people. He was being prepared for leadership, and he was equipped for the task by God himself. Selected by God for leadership, equipped, and Moses had seen this and set him aside. He was with Moses shortly before Moses actually died, and indeed he had a loyalty and support towards Moses at all times. He was the only one with Caleb of all the people who'd come out of Egypt, the only one to make it into the promised land, the land of Canaan. Joshua did not miss out on what God had in store. He was appointed, commissioned, and equipped by God. And I'm going to suggest that that is the basis for all true spiritual leadership. We don't appoint ourselves. Others do it. Others commission us. But a God alone equips. And when he was facing this daunting task, he received a direct commission and a communication from God himself, which was encouragement. An impossible task, God came and met him and encouraged him. That's a little bit about what we know about Joshua. So the Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership. Lay your hand on him. Make him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly and commission him in their presence. Give him some of your authority so that the whole Israelite community will obey him. He is to stand before Eleazar the priest, who will obtain decisions for him by inquiring of the Urim before the Lord." Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and made him stand before Eleazar the priest and the whole assembly. And he laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord instructed through Moses. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. The Lord said, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, Joshua, you and all these people, get ready to cross the river Jordan into the land I'm about to give to them. I'll give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you, nor forsake you." Let's look at a picture of the land itself and the task that was lying ahead for Joshua. The Israelites had travelled up the east side of the Dead Sea. You can see it in the arrow there. And they'd conquered the land on the east side of the Dead Sea. Here are some of the places that are important at the beginning. So the land to the east of the Jordan had been overrun and taken by the Israelite people. And they'd established a base camp at this place known as Shittim. But the next major obstacle was getting across the river Jordan, and it was in flood. How was Joshua going to get people across, including women and children? And the first town on the West Bank was the little fortress of Jericho. That was the first town they had to deal with. So they had to cross that river and they had to take Jericho. But they had to cross the river without the people on the other side knowing. Otherwise, they'd be picked off as they made their way across. That's the context of the story starting. Let's look at the land in a broader picture here. Set in a rift valley, the Lake of Galilee, which flows through the River Jordan down to the Dead Sea. The rains in the north, the Galilee rises, the River Jordan goes into flood at that time of the year. Now let's fast forward to the land that they were going to have. That's a rough picture of the land that the Israelite nation actually took. That was the task that was lying ahead of Joshua. Now let's look at the book of Joshua in very general terms. First of all, Joshua originally was known as Hoshea. That name means someone rescues. So often in the Hebrew, names have meanings. Moses renamed Hoshea Joshua. And that small change of lettering changes the meaning. And perhaps Moses was seeing what Joshua was going to do. All of this is set in the late Bronze Age, and indeed the people of Israel were still in the Bronze Age. And that limited weapons. So perhaps round about the 14th century BC, we can set these stories. In Numbers, there's a picture here of Joshua described as being given a spirit of leadership. Now, spirit could be capital S or small s. Hebrew doesn't tell. But some people have been given the God-given ability to be leaders. Joshua had it. God gives us gifts and he gives us them by his Spirit, so it doesn't really matter whether it's a capital S or a small s. Later, he's described as having a spirit of wisdom. Same things apply here. Joshua was given wisdom by God. Wisdom facing a daunting task. We don't know who wrote the book. Somebody had recorded the events. They're recorded vividly. They're recorded with a lot of realism. But we don't know who it was. In those days, people couldn't read or write in general, and the stories would have been told and passed down till someone wrote them down. But it flows smoothly from the book of Deuteronomy and on to the book of Judges. And that suggests that probably someone edited these things together and made the whole thing tell a smooth story and took the great stories of what Joshua had done and wove it together into a complete picture. These are some of the things about the book of Joshua. What about the main themes? It centers on Yahweh, God, the self-existent God, the God of relationship. That's what the word means. It also centers on the word the Torah. We translate that so often as the law, and that really doesn't give a correct picture of what the Torah is or means. Centered on the land that God was giving to his people, but very much centered on Joshua, the great leader, in completing this task. The central theme is God himself. The book is centered on God and what God was doing. But the picture of God is a God who was holy and faithful. He kept his word. The nations round about had their gods, but their gods were really just pictures of human beings. Yahweh, the God of the Jewish people, was a God who was distant, the great, mighty creator God, who was separate from human beings, utterly faithful, who kept his word. The self-existent one, but the one, the God of relationships. The focus attention so often is on the law, the Torah, God's instructions for the people of God as to how they should live. Very often the people didn't obey this covenant law, and they missed out on God's blessings. Then there was the land, God's land, given to them as their possession. And it's made clear to them that they were given it by God. But we have to remember also that God also said that the land could be lost if the people did not follow Yahweh. And in many points of history, it was lost for that very reason. There is no permanence in this possession unless there's a permanence of obedience. That was the means of taking over the land. It required quality leadership, leadership of the highest order, a task that just was impossible. And we have here a leadership model. Sadly, it wasn't seen again, because after the death of Joshua, the leadership structures just fell apart, and the land was leaderless for so long. But a wonderful picture of leadership that we can take forward even today. These are the main themes which we're going to slowly unpack in this series of presentations. Back to our map. That's the land that they were going to eventually to take over, the nation of Israel, as it came to be. Seen as one people, formed under one covenant. God gave them the land. That was his bargain, his promise, for a purpose. They were brought together as one people under one God. They were destined to live in one land, living lives the way God planned and intended for them. Success. But there was a purpose. This tiny land, you can see in the map there, the Rift Valley from the Galilee to the Dead Sea, a volcanic area. But this tiny land, a little bridge set in the Middle East, a bridge that reaches into Europe, Asia, and Africa. This tiny land with God's people living in it. And the intention and God's plan was that this people would reach out to the nations round about and show these nations about Yahweh, the great creator God of the universe, and to bless the world by showing people how God planned things for them and how they could live a fulfilled life God's way. Now the nation of Israel failed. But from the nation of Israel was born Jesus. And on behalf of the nation of Israel, personified Israel, Jesus succeeded where the nation had failed. So from this nation, the world was blessed and reached out. And the great God, the Creator God, who loves and cares for humanity, was made known to the world. And it started in this tiny nation, in this little strip of land, set as a bridge between continents. See, that's God's strategy. And it was fulfilled eventually in Jesus. But this is the starting point, when Joshua would lead the people into the land, which would be their secure base from which they were intended to reach out and bless the world, as had been promised to Abraham, their forefather, these centuries before. The book of Joshua is books of stories, stories of the conquest of a land. We're familiar with many of them, but they raise interesting questions. I'm not going to address all these questions at the moment, but these questions we will address in the presentations to follow. Questions that may puzzle you. They've puzzled me, and they're not neat answers. It's a book of action. It's a book of stories, but some of it's pretty violent. How do we square that with a God of love? We don't know whether it was one author or many authors, and in some ways it doesn't matter. God can show us things through one or many. We don't know when the book was compiled. It doesn't really matter. God can speak to us through this book. What we do know is that looking at other sources of evidence, the book rings true. It fits the facts. There's a lot of detail given, a lot of history there. And indeed, a lot of archaeology being done subsequently throws a lot of light on the book of Joshua, much of it supporting the accuracy of Joshua. Oh yes, there are many places where archaeology hasn't got the answers yet, where things have not yet been found. But again, this supports our confidence in this book. But there are strange events in it. There are miracles that take a bit of thinking about. Why are they there? What do they mean? We'll address these as we go on. What about this strange practice of circumcision, still practiced in the Jewish communities today with all male children? Before they took Jericho, all the men were circumcised. Why? A difficult question to answer. And how about the story where a family was stoned because the father of the family had stolen things? We'll look at that story. How do we understand that? But as they took over the land, the people who lived there were basically exterminated. Where's the ethics and morality of that one? Again, it's an issue we've got to address in this book. And there were some people who ended up enslaved. There are big questions that we've got to ask of this book. Big questions about the nature of what God's people are all about and what God is wanting. Questions for today, where sadly there's a lot of violence in the world. Sadly, where people are being exterminated and where others are being enslaved and exploited. There's much in this book that's relevant to our modern world, and it touches upon major issues. Let me give you just 5 key lessons for today from this book. We've got to be very careful that we don't stretch the book too far. It is a book with historical stories, but it's got deep meaning. And it gives us a model for leadership. Joshua's leadership, it gives us a model we desperately need to take account of today. We need a model for leadership. And a very important principle. God gave the land. God owns the whole universe. It's God's land. God gave the land to the people. But the people had to cross the Jordan, and they had to take the land, which meant hard-going battles. And this is a principle of life. God gives, but he expects us to make the effort to take what he gives. And that fundamental principle is there also. When we do things God's way, it all drops into place. It works. It's just the same as anything in this world. When we run any piece of machinery the way it was designed to be run, following the maker's instructions, it works. So often we try to do it our way. And there are examples in this book of that. Then it doesn't work. And throughout this and underpinning it all is the basis of living God's way. Not to try and win a place in heaven or paradise, but because when we live it lives God's way, that's the successful way. He made us. He knows how we work best. He knows what leads to success. Fundamental principle. And that when we've lost today so much among God's people, there has to be a unity of purpose. Not a uniformity of thinking, but a unity of purpose. So that we can work together, doing it God's way, appropriating what God has given. That's the way forward. There are some key lessons for us today. And as we go through this series, we'll see some of these worked out in practical contexts. Let's quickly look at Joshua chapter 1. There's our map again. Notice the scale at the bottom. The land is not huge. It's a small land. The people were not given vast territory. A small land. And they were supposed to use that as a base to reach out, to bless the nations round about. The instructions to Joshua: now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the river Jordan into the land I'm about to give to the Israelites. You can't stay in the base camp any longer. Time to move. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses, the God who can be relied on to keep his word. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Here's a wonderful promise. God will not let us down. But Joshua, you've got to be strong, courageous. Believe me, trust it, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. That's your response. You can't sit in the base camp. Get organized. Cross the Jordan. Start the battles. But be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. God's instructions leads to success. We'll come back to that in a moment or two. And it goes on, keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you'll be prosperous and successful. What a picture. What an encouragement to this man, this natural leader who'd been given a spirit of leadership and wisdom, but he was facing a daunting task of taking a group of people who'd been wandering in the desert across a river in flood, and to mould them into an army that would conquer the land. That's the picture to Joshua. That's what's lying ahead of you, Joshua. Success. Time to move. Time for success. And if I put it in my words, it would be, come on, Joshua, get ready. The success is promised, and I will not let you down. But you've got to be strong and courageous. You've got to do it. You've got to exert the leadership. You've got to take the front place. But do it my way. I know the best way. I'll guide you. I'll show you. Follow my instructions. Indeed, pass my instructions on to the people, that they'll live following my instructions, because that's the best way for them. And I'll be with you every step of the way. What a picture. Perhaps you or your group are facing some daunting task or some big decisions. There comes a moment when we have to move out of base camp and stop sitting around and get ready. Do it God's way and cross the Jordan and take territory for God. What a picture is given here in this book of Joshua. I want to focus on these words a little bit more, because they've been often ripped out of context. Let me read them. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you'll be prosperous and successful. I want to focus on just a few phrases. If we look at the original, it says to observe to do all of the Torah which Moses instructed you. Remember, Moses had been with Joshua for decades. Joshua was his assistant. Joshua had learned from Moses. Moses could read and write. He'd been trained in Egypt. Perhaps he taught Joshua to read and write, because Joshua, as we'll discover, could do these. Most people couldn't. To do all of the Torah, which Moses instructed you. Similar phrase, book of the law. Now, they didn't have books in these days. The book hadn't been invented. In the original, it is the scroll of the Torah, because papyrus had been invented by the Egyptians long, long before this. And Moses would have known about that and known how to use them and to write on them. The scroll of the Torah. Now, what is meant by this word Torah? It's a Hebrew word, and it simply means teaching or instruction. So often people argue about which books of the Old Testament constitute the Torah. It seems a bit pointless, because the word means teaching or instruction. Now, I've put my description of this, God's direction for the lifestyle of his people. God knows the best way for us. God is not a heavenly policeman trying to make our lives miserable. God will give us direction so that our lives will be prosperous and successful and fulfilled. We will achieve what God intended us to achieve. We'll be happy and fulfilled and successful in doing it. What a picture. So often these verses are ripped out as instruction that we've got to pay attention to the Bible. The Bible did not exist in those days. There was the Torah, God's direction for the lifestyle of his people. Most of the books that we have in the Bible today were written long later. And this is a much bigger thing. It includes everything in the Bible, yes, but it underpins it. Teaching or instruction. God wants us to have the greatest life possible. He wants us to be successful, to be prosperous. That doesn't mean making lots of money. Prosperous means doing what he wants us to do and finding utter fulfillment in it. And he's given us this direction. And he'd given a lot to Moses. Moses had passed it on to Joshua, and Joshua was going to pass it on to the people. That's the principles behind this. Because when we live life following God's directions in our lifestyle, prosperity and success will come. That's God's purpose for us. But let's focus on that little picture a little bit more. It's often misunderstood. You see, God's direction for our lifestyle is given to us so that we can have success in completing God's tasks. He wants us to have fulfilled lives, happy lives, lives of destiny, lives of purpose, lives of achievement, lives of success. And he wants it for you and for me. That's the biblical emphasis. And that's what God's teaching and instruction, God's Torah, is all about. The trouble is, we've so often messed it up. And we've used this idea of a set of rules. And if we keep enough rules, we win God's favour. And if we win God's favour, we get access to heaven or paradise. That's the way of religion. And it's crept into our thinking in the West so often. And it's getting stronger with the Islamic influence. Because in Islam, everything is seen as a set of rules to be obeyed. Obey enough of them, God will let you into paradise when you die. It doesn't work. It cannot work. It's utterly unfair because we all start from different baselines of experience, background and knowledge. And stop for a minute. Do you think anything you can do or I can do can ever win God's favour? God is bigger than that. God wants the best for us. Let's wipe out the religious emphasis. Let's get rid of these wrong ideas. The idea of trying to win God's favour by keeping rules. Let's burn it out. And let's come back to this emphasis. Teaching and instruction. God's direction for the lifestyle of his people. Because when we live life the way he planned it and intends it, we will have success, fulfillment, destiny, purpose, prosperity. That's what God wants for us. What a wonderful picture. And that's the emphasis that was given to Joshua. And that's a biblical emphasis throughout all the books. The time is for action. You can't sit around in base camp any longer. So Joshua starts. He briefs his leadership to get the supplies ready. That's practical. Some of the tribes were to be settled on the east bank of the Jordan. But they were, part of the agreement was they were to join, the men were to join, to conquer the west. So they were to come too. Joshua calls the people for obedience and they respond, we will obey. He then sends out spies to check out Jericho, to see what the problems lie ahead. So it's all practical as he's getting ready to cross the River Jordan. Let's bring it together. Success in life, success in the great adventures for God. Remember, it's God's battle, but it does need human leadership. That takes a lot of pressure off human leadership in Christian communities. It's God's battle. It's God's work. It's not decided, planned, or resourced by humans. But it does need true leadership. And we have a wonderful picture of leadership given us in Joshua. But we need to follow his instructions because he knows the way success in the future can happen. And we live God's way because God's way of living leads to fulfillment, prosperity, success. He designed us for it and he will guide us to it. And we've got to work together in unity. We must have a common purpose, a common goal. But God gave the land, but he required the people to go and take it over. And again, that is such an important principle. We can't sit around waiting for God to do it. He gives it, yes, but we've got to get up, take action, plan, prepare, do it, and get on with it. And leadership must be strong and courageous because it's God's battle. He gives the instructions. He provides the way of success. He's there every step of the way. He won't let us down. We have to be practical. We have to make the preparations. We have to do things. But that is ultimately the key. If it's God's work and we're following God's instructions, God will be with us every step of the way. Every step of the way. What a picture was given to Joshua, and what a picture is given to us today. The next presentation, we're going to look at the initial crossing, getting across the Jordan and getting ready to take the land.